Donald Trump has linked his drive to take control of Greenland to his failure to win the Nobel Peace Prize. America's editor John Lyons joins us now from Washington. John, this emerged in a text exchange between the US President and the Norwegian Prime Minister. Talk us through it.
Well, Bridget, this is quite extraordinary, really, and we're not easily shocked anymore with President Trump in the White House. He's a very unorthodox president, but this really takes things to a new level. It's all about Greenland, which, of course, is a territory of Denmark. Now, the Americans want to take over Greenland. They say that strategically it's important. It's up there near the Arctic Circle. It's like a window into Russia. And so the Americans say that if they don't take it, China or Russia will. But now the European countries are starting to really react and say you shouldn't do this. Some European countries are sending soldiers there to try to prevent an American military takeover, which in itself is extraordinary.
Hi buddies, Adam is here. Stop whatever you're doing right now and listen to me, because this is one of those moments where the actual words matter more than any spin anyone could put on them. Donald Trump texted the Prime Minister of Norway, a NATO ally, a partner nation, a friendly government, to complain that he didn't win the Nobel Peace Prize. That's real. That happened. And then he told that same foreign leader that because he didn't get the award, he no longer feels an obligation to think purely of peace.
US President Donald Trump says he no longer thinks purely of peace. In a letter obtained by Reuters, Trump told Norway's Prime Minister he no longer feels obligated to prioritize peace after failing to win the Nobel Peace Prize.
Considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars plus, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace, although it will always be predominant, but can now think about what is good and proper for the United States of America.
The letter was a response to Norway's Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre and Finland's President Alexander Stubb, who criticised Trump's tariffs on European allies after Trump threatened to impose them on countries standing in his way of taking control of Greenland.
And then, as if that wasn't enough, he tied his personal grievance directly to his territorial ambitions, writing that the world is not safe unless we have complete and total control of Greenland. Complete and total control of territory belonging to Denmark, another NATO ally, justified in part by a temper tantrum about an awards committee. PBS and BBC both confirmed the content of these official diplomatic communications.
I'm a fan of Denmark too, I have to tell you, and you know, they've been very nice to me. I'm a big fan, but you know, the fact that they had a boat land there 500 years ago doesn't mean that they own the land. I'm sure we had lots of boats go there also. But we need that, because if you take a look outside of Greenland right now, there are Russian destroyers, there are Chinese destroyers and bigger, there are Russian submarines all over the place. We're not going to have Russia or China occupy Greenland, and that's what they're going to do if we don't. So we're going to be doing something with Greenland, either the nice way or the more difficult way.
This is not a leak from some anonymous source with an agenda. This is documented presidential text messages now part of the permanent public record. And within hours of these texts becoming public, Congress absolutely exploded. Bernie Sanders called it pathetic and demanded action to block any attempt to annex Greenland. Sydney Kamlager-Dove said invoke the 25th Amendment. Yassamin Ansari said Trump is extremely mentally ill and the 25th needs to be invoked immediately.
Families are living under constant threat. Masked ICE officers without badges or identification are terrorizing and detaining our community members. Trump wants to fight for an ICE-covered Greenland, but we need to fight against ICE-covered communities in America. Dr. King won the Nobel Prize for being a paragon of peace. Donald Trump wants to declare war on Greenland because Norway hurt his feelings by not giving him a Nobel Peace Prize. That is why we need to invoke the 25th Amendment, because that is lunacy. We cannot sleepwalk into World War III. As Dr. King said, the time is always right to do what is right. And right now, that means we have to fight.
Ed Markey posted invoke the 25th Amendment with the Norway text screenshot attached as specific evidence. And Al Green's existing impeachment articles, already sitting on the Congressional record, were cited as the formal legislative expression of the removal argument that this text just dramatically intensified. Now let me be completely transparent with you because that's what this channel does. The FLEES meeting part of the headline reflects the political reality of an administration that is avoiding direct confrontation with this accountability pressure rather than a specific verified walkout from a specific identified meeting. The research shows that actual walkout scenes appear primarily in dramatized content rather than verified news reporting. But what is entirely real, entirely documented, entirely on the permanent record is the Norway text, the Congressional explosion, the 25th Amendment calls from named members of Congress, the existing impeachment articles, and the undeniable reality that removal pressure on Trump is at its highest point of his entire second term right now. That is the story we're covering today, and it is genuinely explosive. Let me give you the full context you need to understand why these texts produced such an immediate and intense congressional response, and why the specific content is so alarming to lawmakers invoking the 25th Amendment rather than just making ordinary political criticisms. The distinction between ordinary foreign policy disagreement and 25th Amendment invocation is a constitutional distinction that matters. Presidents make foreign policy decisions that Congress disagrees with all the time. The normal remedies for those disagreements are legislative, through funding restrictions, through the War Powers Framework, through bipartisan legislation. The 25th Amendment is different. It's not a remedy for bad policy. It's a remedy for inability. For situations where something about the president's capacity or judgment has deteriorated to the point where they cannot discharge the duties of the office. When Ansari calls Trump extremely mentally ill and says the 25th needs to be invoked immediately, she's not saying she disagrees with his Greenland policy. She's making a specific constitutional claim about his fitness, about whether the conduct revealed by the Norway text reflects a president capable of making rational foreign policy decisions, or a president whose judgment has been so compromised by personal grievance that he's tying nuclear-armed alliance relationships to personal awards committee decisions. That constitutional claim about capacity rather than policy is what the 25th Amendment is designed to address. And the Norway texts are the specific evidence the lawmakers invoking it are pointing to. And the PBS and BBC reporting matters because independent international news organizations confirming the content of an official presidential diplomatic communication makes the story impossible to dismiss as partisan characterization. These aren't leaked political documents from a hostile source. These are official diplomatic communications. A text from the President of the United States to a foreign head of government reported by major international news organizations. The content of those communications, the Nobel grievance, the no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace statement, the complete and total control of Greenland framing, that's the documented reality of how this administration is conducting foreign policy in its own official communications with allied governments. Now let me dig into what these texts actually mean and why each element is so damaging. Start with the Nobel Prize grievance. Complaining to a foreign leader that you didn't win an award is alarming on its own terms. But the significance is amplified enormously by what he said next. A president who is merely frustrated about not receiving an award might express that frustration in various ways. But the specific escalation from Nobel grievance to no longer feeling an obligation to think purely of peace is the element that makes the text constitutionally significant rather than just personally revealing. Peace as a guiding principle of American foreign policy is not supposed to be conditional on awards committee decisions. The commitment to pursuing peaceful resolution of international disputes rather than military or coercive solutions is supposed to be a foundational value that exists independent of any individual president's personal circumstances. When a president communicates to a foreign leader that his commitment to peaceful approaches is contingent on personal gratification, that the absence of an award changes his calculation about whether peace is a priority, he is describing a foreign policy decision-making process driven by personal grievance rather than national interest or strategic calculation. That description in an official diplomatic communication is what the 25th Amendment invocations are pointing to as evidence of unfitness rather than just bad policy. And the complete and total control of Greenland's statement tied directly to the Nobel grievance in the same communication is the territorial ambition dimension that makes the overall picture so alarming in the specific NATO alliance context. Greenland is a territory of Denmark. Denmark is a NATO founding member, one of America's closest and most important alliance partners. The United States has a treaty obligation to defend Denmark, and Denmark has a treaty obligation to defend the United States under the collective defense framework of the North Atlantic Treaty. Threatening to use coercive force to seize Greenland from a NATO ally in a text that ties that threat to a personal grievance about a peace prize is not an aggressive negotiating posture within the normal range of alliance management. It is a statement that the administration is prepared to use coercive force against an ally in violation of the foundational principles of the alliance that has been the cornerstone of American national security for 75 years because the president is personally unhappy about an award. Now let's talk about the 25th Amendment calls, because the specific constitutional argument the invoking lawmakers are making deserves careful examination. Section 4 of the 25th Amendment allows the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet to declare a president unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office, immediately transferring those powers to the Vice President as acting president. The constitutional standard, inability to discharge the powers and duties, has historically been understood to encompass both physical incapacity and mental or cognitive incapacity. Situations where something about the president's condition prevents them from performing the fundamental functions of the presidency. The lawmakers invoking the 25th Amendment over the Norway text are making a specific and targeted version of the mental fitness argument. Not a general claim about Trump's overall mental health, but a specific claim about what the Norway texts reveal about his decision-making process. Their argument, stated in the calls they're making, is that a president whose diplomatic communications tie nuclear-armed alliance relationships to personal awards grievances, who says his commitment to peace is conditional on receiving a prize, is a president whose judgment in the specific domain of foreign policy and national security has deteriorated to the point where the inability standard is met. Whether that argument would succeed in an actual 25th Amendment proceeding, which requires Vance and the Cabinet to act, is a separate question. But as a constitutional argument about what the Norway texts reveal, it is a serious and specific claim that deserves to be evaluated on its merits rather than dismissed as political hyperbole. Now let's talk about the impeachment picture, because Al Green's articles and the progressive coalition around them sit within a broader strategic reality. A Republican House blocks advancement of impeachment articles. The Al Green articles accusing Trump of heinous actions proposed and heinous actions carried out, including threats against lawmakers and judges, were tabled by the Republican majority. But here's what the Norway texts do to the impeachment strategic picture. They add a specific and documented foreign policy dimension to the factual record that the impeachment case is building. A presidential communication that explicitly ties peace commitments to personal grievances, that reveals the personal motivation behind one of the most destabilizing foreign policy positions of the second term, and that has already generated the most intense bipartisan condemnation of any single Trump foreign policy action since he returned to office. The Sanders characterization, pathetic, is not Sanders at his most restrained. It is Sanders saying in plain language what the content of the text revealed to anyone who read them carefully. The combination of the Norway text with the accumulated record of court defiance and constitutional overreach creates a factual picture for a post-2026 impeachment case that is considerably more comprehensive and more specific than what existed at any point in Trump's first term. CNN and Washington Post reporting that most House Democrats are not yet pushing a full impeachment drive because Republicans control the chamber, but that party strategists concede a future Democratic majority could quickly revive impeachment based on Trump's second-term record, is the most important strategic context for understanding what the current removal calls actually represent. They are not, in the current political moment, a realistic path to removal. They are a documented record-building exercise, a political and constitutional accountability campaign, establishing the factual and legal foundation for proceedings that become possible if the 2026 midterms produce the House flip that Trump himself has predicted would lead to his impeachment. Every 25th Amendment call, every impeachment article filing, every Norway text denunciation adds to the accumulated record that a Democratic House majority would inherit as a starting point for whatever accountability proceedings it chose to initiate. Let me bring this all the way home with 4 clear points that you need to take away from this video. Point 1. The Norway texts are the single most revealing document in the entire foreign policy accountability story because they provide direct documentary evidence in Trump's own words of the relationship between his personal grievances and his foreign policy decision-making. That evidence is now permanently in the public record as the factual foundation for every subsequent accountability argument about his fitness for office. The documentary character matters because political characterizations can always be dismissed as partisan interpretation. A text message in Trump's own words tying his peace commitments to a Nobel Prize grievance cannot be dismissed that way. It is documentary evidence of a specific decision-making process, a primary source, not a second-hand characterization. The 25th Amendment callers pointing to the Norway text are pointing to a document, not an interpretation of a document. Point 2. The bipartisan dimension of the congressional response. Sanders calling it pathetic, the existing Greenland legislation, the Senate votes, all of it reflecting cross-party recognition that the Norway text crossed the line. This is the political feature that gives the accountability response its most significant long-term consequence. When Republican voices are joining the characterization that specific Trump conduct has gone too far, the incident breaks out of the partisan noise and into the broader political conversation that affects independent voters and soft Republicans in the competitive districts that determine midterm outcomes. The Norway texts, with their combination of documented absurdity and genuine alliance damage, have the potential to be one of those incidents. The breadth of condemnation they generated is the early indicator of whether that potential is being realized. Point 3. The strategic positioning of the current removal calls. Building the record for a post-2026 Democratic House majority while maintaining political pressure in the current moment is the most important context for understanding what the 25th Amendment calls and the impeachment article references are actually designed to accomplish. A Democratic House majority after 2026 would inherit a factual record of second-term presidential conduct that includes the Norway text, the court defiance pattern, the Bondi document suppression, and the full range of conduct we have covered. That inherited record is a foundation for whatever impeachment proceedings a Democratic majority might initiate. The strength and specificity of that foundation is determined by what gets documented now through the 25th Amendment calls, the impeachment article filings, the congressional denunciations that create a permanent public record of what members of Congress found alarming and why. Point 4. Here's what we need to watch as the Norway text fallout continues. The administration's diplomatic response, whether it acknowledges the damage to alliance relationships and attempts damage control or doubles down on Greenland territorial ambitions, will determine whether the texts become a contained incident or a continuing source of tension. The response of Republican senators, particularly those who have already shown willingness to break with the administration on Greenland and tariff issues, will determine whether the bipartisan condemnation deepens into formal legislative response. The 2026 midterm polling trajectory, specifically whether the Norway texts affect approval numbers in competitive districts, will be the most important indicator of whether the texts represent a political turning point. And Trump's own response to the congressional explosion, whether he escalates, backs down, or shifts to a different provocation, will shape the next chapter of the foreign policy accountability story. Here's the bottom line. Trump texted the Norwegian Prime Minister to complain about not receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, told him he no longer feels an obligation to think purely of peace, and wrote that the world is not safe without complete and total control of Greenland, tying his territorial ambitions directly to a personal awards grievance in an official diplomatic communication. PBS and BBC confirmed the content. Sanders called it pathetic. Ansari called Trump extremely mentally ill and demanded immediate 25th Amendment invocation. Markey posted, "Invoke the 25th Amendment with the text screenshot as evidence." Kamlager-Dove joined the call. Al Green's impeachment articles were cited as the formal expression of the removal argument. Most House Democrats are not pushing full impeachment now because Republicans control the chamber, but party strategists acknowledge a Democratic majority after 2026 could quickly revive impeachment based on the accumulated second-term record. The removal pressure is at its highest point of the second term. The documentary evidence is permanently in the public record, and the bipartisan condemnation is the early indicator of a political moment that could affect the midterm environment in ways that determine whether the accountability pressure this session has been documenting ever reaches the institutional conclusion it has been building toward.